Senator Amy Klobuchar took money from a Ponzi schemer, over $120,000. She had evidence to prosecute this leader of the Ponzi scheme in 1999. And now today, she's planning to run for Minnesota governor to replace Tim Walz. But here's what they're not telling you. The scheme she covered up was the second largest Ponzi scheme in American history. Hey everyone, and welcome back. And for those of you that are just joining us, buckle up, because today we're exposing something that the mainstream media has conveniently forgot to tell you about. So here's what we're diving into. First, Amy Klobuchar really is behind the moderate mask. Second, the billion-dollar Ponzi scheme she helped protect. Third, her deep ties to Minnesota's Democrat machine and the Mondale family. And fourth, the real kicker here, why putting her in charge after Walz's fraud scandal is like hiring an arsonist to run the fire department. If you're tired of being gaslit by the corrupt politicians, make sure that you're subscribed here to America First Alerts. We're exposing this kind of stuff every single day. Let's get into it. So Tim Walz dropped out yesterday. Not a huge surprise when you consider the amount of attention he's getting from the Department of Justice and the FBI right now. Fraud scandal totally destroyed his career. Tens of billions of dollars have been stolen through Somali learning centers, this whole thing. We have other videos that cover that. But within hours, literally hours, the New York Times reported that Amy Klobuchar is considering to run to replace Tim Walz. My first thought, yeah, okay, they need somebody clean to distance themselves from this Walz corruption. But then I started digging, and what I found, let me just say, Amy Klobuchar makes Tim Walz look like a Boy Scout. This woman has a corruption trail that spans decades, and somehow, just somehow, the media acts like she's this wholesome Midwestern senator. So before we get any further, drop a comment down below here if you've ever heard about Klobuchar's Ponzi scheme. I just want to kind of see where everybody sits on this. All right, so let me take you back to the 1990s. Amy Klobuchar is the top prosecutor at Hennepin County, Minnesota. That's in Minneapolis. It's a big job, and that's a lot of responsibility. So with this big job, she was supposed to go after major criminals, protect the taxpayers, and uphold the law. There's actually a businessman named Tom Peters. He's running multiple companies in Minnesota. He seems successful, and he was quite politically connected. And by the way, he's also running the biggest fraud scheme in Minnesota history. Now, did Klobuchar know this? Oh yeah, she knew. According to documents obtained by the Daily Caller, and this was reported by Matthew Boyle back in 2012, Klobuchar had enough evidence in 1999 to prosecute Tom Peters for fraud. But what did she choose to do? Nothing. She didn't prosecute him. Instead, she went after his low-level co-conspirators, those little guys, the people that couldn't fight back. And what happened with Tom Peters? He kept running his Ponzi scheme for almost another decade. So do you want to know why Klobuchar didn't prosecute him? Tom Peters and his companies gave Klobuchar $8,500 for her re-election campaign. Then, this is where it gets really dirty, when she ran for U.S. Senate, Peters and his employees gave her campaign over $120,000. One of Peters' co-conspirators, a guy named Richard Hetler, who eventually went to prison, told the Daily Caller this. She, insert Amy Klobuchar, took Ponzi money to get elected. Let me say that again. She took Ponzi money to get elected. Now, before we go any further, totally smash the like button, please. It helps us a lot. Because what I'm actually about to show you connects to some of the most powerful Democrats in Minnesota history. Okay, you might be thinking, all right, Amy took some campaign money and looked the other way. That's bad, but politicians do that all the time. I understand, it's a fair point, but it gets so much worse. One of Tom Peters' companies had a vice president named Ted Mondale. That name sound familiar? Ted Mondale was the son of Walter Mondale, former vice president of the United States under Jimmy Carter. And before Amy Klobuchar became a prosecutor, where did she work? Dorsey and Whitney law firm in Minneapolis. Well, guess who also worked at Dorsey and Whitney? Walter Mondale since 1987. So you're seeing these connections here? Klobuchar worked at the same law firm as the former vice president. Then she becomes top prosecutor. Then the former VP's son works for a company running a massive Ponzi scheme. Then that company gives her over $120,000 in campaign contributions. Oh, and then she refuses to prosecute the guy running the scheme. This isn't incompetence. This is corruption. This is actually the Minnesota Democrat machine protecting its own. So what happened to Tom Peters? Well, in 2008, almost a decade after Klobuchar had evidence, the federal government finally arrested him. Not Minnesota, not Amy Klobuchar's office, the feds. And when they unraveled his operation, guess how big it was? Well, it was $3.65 billion. This makes it the second largest Ponzi scheme in U.S. history. Only Bernie Madoff was bigger. Tom Peters got convicted of wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering. 20 counts, actually, in total. He's currently serving a 50-year sentence at Leavenworth. He'll actually die in prison. But here's the most insane part of this entire story. When Tom Peters got arrested by the FBI, guess who was the first call that he made? Amy Klobuchar. And guess what she did? She recommended the lawyer that he should hire. Yeah, the same Klobuchar who had evidence against him in 1999. The same Amy Klobuchar who took $120,000 from him and his employees. Yes, and that same Amy Klobuchar who chose not to prosecute him. She recommended his defense lawyer. I mean, seriously, you cannot make this stuff up. So this is all documented by Peter Schweitzer in his book, Profiles in Corruption. And if you haven't read that book, you should. It's a great read, and it exposes all of this stuff in detail. And remember, this is the woman that Minnesota Democrats want to replace Tim Walz, as if she's the solution to a corruption problem. Now, if you're still watching, you're going to love what comes next because it gets even more corrupt. Make sure you hit that like button while you get a chance here. So that's the Ponzi scheme story, but Klobuchar's corruption doesn't stop there. Let me give you a more recent example. In 2022, Klobuchar was the driving force. That's a quote from Breitbart News' Alan Bakary, behind the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Fancy name, right? Well, you know what it actually was? It was a bailout for failing mainstream media companies. Democrat media cronies were losing money, they were losing viewers, and they were going bankrupt. So what did Amy Klobuchar do? She tried to force through legislation to give them your tax dollars to keep them afloat. A total media bailout to protect the people who lie to you every single day. But it gets worse. Peter Schweitzer documented that Klobuchar votes with Bernie Sanders 88% of the time. 88%! But she runs as a moderate. She campaigns as this pragmatic Midwestern senator who works across the aisle. Folks, it's a complete act. She's as far left as they come. And this is my favorite stat, she's one of the top recipients of corporate campaign donations in the entire U.S. Senate. So let me get this straight. She votes like Bernie Sanders, who rails against corporations, but she's taking more corporate money than almost anyone. You know what that is? That's corruption with a smile. That's actually the Minnesota nice version of selling America out. So Schweitzer documents a pattern where executives from a specific company will coordinate donations to Klobuchar over a 2 or 3 day period. Dozens of donations all at once. And then within weeks, she introduces legislation that specifically benefits that company. Actually, let me correct that. It doesn't benefit them, it massively benefits them. So we're talking targeted legislation that could be worth millions to that company. So she's not representing voters, she's representing these companies' checkbooks. Now, I covered some of the Minnesota fraud connections in my video about Tim Walz and the $110 million scandal. You can see that video up above here. If you haven't seen it, you should. It definitely does a good job of outlining some of the corruption that runs really deep in Minnesota. This corruption isn't isolated, it's systematic. So let's pause. What's the one word that you would use to describe Senator Amy Klobuchar? The best comment will get pinned. So right when you thought it just couldn't get any worse, well, it does, because the plot gets even thicker. According to reports from Town Hall's Dustin Grage, the plan isn't just for Klobuchar to replace Tim Walz as governor. The plan is for Klobuchar to appoint Tim Walz to the U.S. Senate. So let me say that again. The plan is for Senator Amy Klobuchar to appoint Tim Walz to her U.S. Senate seat. So Walz drops out in disgrace over a massive fraud scandal. Klobuchar steps in, and then she rewards him with a Senate seat. It's a kickback scheme. Walz takes the fall for the fraud scandal, and Klobuchar cleans up by becoming governor. But then she makes sure that Walz is taken care of by giving him one of the cushiest jobs in America, a U.S. Senator seat. But here's the kicker. Klobuchar isn't up for re-election until 2030. So even if she loses the governor's race, she still keeps her Senate race. She literally risks nothing. It's all upside for her. She either becomes governor or she stays senator. It's a win-win. Meanwhile, Minnesota taxpayers get to watch two corrupt Democrats play musical chairs, all while billions of their money vanishes into fraud schemes. This is the Minnesota swamp. This is actually what we're fighting against, and this is why Trump got elected twice, because Americans are sick of these rigged systems. So let me paint you the full picture of what's happening in Minnesota right now. Tim Walz presided over the largest state-level fraud scandal in recent American history. Tens of billions of dollars were stolen. Somali learning centers that were money laundering operations. Federal prosecutors are just getting started. So the Democrats need to sacrifice Walz. He's got to go. But they can't just let him fade away. Walz knows too much. He's too connected. He could turn on them. So what's their solution? Amy Klobuchar becomes governor. She appoints him to the Senate. He keeps his mouth shut, and everyone's happy, except the taxpayers who got robbed. But here's the problem, their plan. Amy Klobuchar's corruption is arguably worse than Walz's. She protected a $3.65 billion Ponzi scheme. She took money from the guy running it. She recommended his defense lawyer when he got arrested, and that's all documented. It's completely provable. It's all in court records and investigative reporting. So if the Democrats think they're going to clean up their corruption problem by putting Amy Klobuchar in charge, they're delusional. So is there any good news in this story? Yeah, actually there is. The times are different, and our voices are not being silenced and censored anymore. Alternative media exposed the Tim Walz fraud scandal. Nick Shirley, an independent journalist, just showed up with a camera and documented everything. Peter Schweitzer wrote a book, an entire book, exposing Klobuchar's corruption. And Matthew Boyle at Daily Caller got the documents on the Ponzi scheme back in 2012. So the receipts are out there. The evidence is public, and the Democrats can't hide it anymore. And that's why the mainstream media is in a panic. That's why they're trying to memory hole Klobuchar's past. And that's why they're desperate to install her before anyone remembers the Tom Peters story. But we remember, we're not just letting them forget it. All right, so here's what you need to do right now. First, please like this video. This tells YouTube to push the video out to more people. And this video needs to reach every single Minnesotan who's considering voting for Klobuchar. Second, comment down below, worse or same? Is Klobuchar's corruption worse than Tim Walz's or about the same? Let me see what you think in the comments down below. Third, subscribe and hit that bell if you haven't. Tomorrow I'm actually breaking down a whole scandal at Hilton Hotels with the Department of Homeland Security. It's going to be wild, and you're going to want to see that. And fourth, share this video. Specifically, hit any Minnesota Facebook group that you're in. Share it there. Post it on X and tag Amy Klobuchar. Make sure people know who they're really dealing with. And if you want a deep dive into the entire Minnesota corruption machine, check out my complete breakdown of the Tim Walz scandal. I'll put it right up here. I've got all the receipts on this whole operation. So here's the reality. Minnesota Democrats are trying to pull a bait and switch. They're trying to replace an obviously corrupt governor with a less obviously corrupt senator. But we see through it. The corruption doesn't disappear just because you change the name tag. Amy Klobuchar protected a Ponzi schemer. She took his money, and she helped him stay free while he stole billions from Americans. And when he finally got caught, she recommended his lawyer. That's not somebody who should be a governor. That's actually somebody who should be investigated. But you know what? With Trump back in charge, I'm going to bet that the investigation is coming. Because Trump doesn't play the old Washington game of we don't investigate our colleagues. Trump's Department of Justice is looking at Minnesota as we speak. They're looking at the Somali fraud. They're looking at everyone who is involved. And if Amy Klobuchar thinks she can just slide right in to the governor's office and avoid any scrutiny, she's got another thing coming. The swamp is being drained. The corruption is actually being exposed. And no amount of Minnesota nice is going to save her. So Democrats, by all means, go ahead and nominate Amy Klobuchar. Make this easy for us. Run somebody with a documented history of protecting criminals and taking bribes. Let's see how that works out for you. So that's the story that you didn't know. So let's conclude as we always do. God bless America. God bless the truth. And God bless everybody who's trying to expose corruption and get to the truth. I'll see you in the next video. And by the way, folks, stay vigilant out there. Our fight does continue.
Okay, let's go.